Okay, it started in automatic. Hello, everyone. Hello, Dario. We are still just me and you. Let's take a bit of time to give to wait for people to actually join the webinar, and then we can kickstart our conversation around today's topic, based on a report, a mini report actually, that we released not even a couple of weeks ago. So it's quite fresh, based also on the new developments in the ecosystem. So it's going to be quite interesting, quite current in terms of topics we will be dealing with. And yeah, I would hope if the participants actually now joining have interesting questions. I know that more than I know, Daria and I have already prepared a set of questions to dive deeper into the report. But apart from my creativity, I would also hope that the participants indeed share their questions, also based on their background. Hi, Dario.
Hello. So we're probably going to give everyone a couple of minutes, like 2-3 minutes, before we can deep dive into the discussion from today. Good to see some very known names up there. It's also always good to see a few names that I've never seen before. So looking forward to having an engaging discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be grilling you, but hopefully also the participants help me in doing that. But yeah, so basically,
as Anna was also rightly sharing, there's always the chat function, which is somewhere down there, and there's the Q&A, which is somewhere down there. So always feel free to ask us also questions. Both Anna and I will try to cover this one off while we speak. Yeah.
Fantastic. So today's topic is indeed digital health strength in APAC. As I was telling a minute ago, basically, it is the conversation today is based on a small analysis that we did on the current events that have been hitting both the financial worlds and digital health in particular. Of course, as digital health experts, we will cover in detail the digital health part. Before I indeed bring into the conversation my Chief Research Officer, Dr. Dario Heyman, who is critical to today's sessions, I would like to give a bit of context of the landscape we are operating in, and why indeed we came up with this webinar and with this report. Taking a step back, starting from 2021, which indeed was the second year into the pandemic, investors were all rushing into crisis management solutions. It resulted into a record-setting year when it came to funding deployed into digital health. Now, fast forward 18 months later, first quarter of 2023, we have seen, we're going to call it decline, because percentages, numbers are numbers. And indeed, in the case of Asia Pacific, we saw a 40% decline in funding in digital health. However, it's a bit dramatic to call it decline. Indeed, it's more going back into normal levels, both from funding poured into the solutions, but also when it came to the valuation of the companies. What we noticed in the beginning of the year, I mean, we have been all following all the news coming from the States or Europe, and also actually Asia Pacific. Lots of digital health ventures have been reviewing their operating model, and indeed scaling to becoming more efficient in order to be able to operate into the market. So cash flow have been under restraint, because also funding has been very difficult to receive and to raise. What does it mean for the near future in digital health? How we are measuring what is happening in the context, and what examples we have indeed in Asia Pacific. This is where I need Dario to jump in and allow me also to share a small presentation so that we can follow also some numbers with the report, while Dario will indeed provide all the layer and the colors that are needed to interpret those numbers. Fantastic. Let me share the screen, and I'm gonna start with the first question to Dario. We defined a bit the context we're operating in, Dario. So before we indeed dive into the highlights of the report, we have a set of questions that will walk our participants through out of it. Could you please clarify a bit the methodology we used in order to determine the digital health strength of the regions? Small parenthesis, we are doing this webinar in Asia Pacific, but in the coming weeks, there's going to be also one deep diving into the United States one. Over to you, Dario.
Absolutely. So just to clarify again up front, this is not like the typical fund analysis that we're doing. This is literally deep diving into the funding strength of a certain ecosystem. Now, this is part of a series of mini reports that we pick out. If you are on Health Tech IFA, you can download these reports always as you use the platform as well. So as per the funding strength, the methodology behind that is actually quite simple. When you start raising capital, generally you raise cash for about 12 to 18 months, depending on the amount of funding that you raise and the discussion that you have with your investors behind that. Now, what we've been doing for this particular analysis is we are taking a bit of a threshold of 18 months and are basically saying that if a venture hasn't been raising within 18 months fresh capital, then the funding strength becomes extremely, let's call it critical, because if they haven't created a path to profitability and therefore extending their pipeline or extending their runway, the burn rate is so high that a venture might fall under. Now, it always depends on which region you also operate in. Burn rate in Asia Pacific is generally a bit lower as compared to the United States. Headcount is particularly lower, but just for simplicity purposes, put it that way, we generally take these 18 months as a particular runway, considering that also funding amounts that we are raising are significantly smaller in this part of the world as compared to other parts of the world as well.
Fantastic. So time range, 18 months. Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Fantastic. Let's continue the conversation with a deep dive of what we notice in Asia Pacific.
Okay, so for Asia Pacific, it's actually quite interesting. So when you look into the ventures that actually have raised funding over the past 36 months, so at twice as much runway, it's actually fairly high. Late stage ventures were about 92% of these, basically showing that there has been quite a strong funding inflow over the past months happening. When you look into growth stage, this already goes down, and the early stage in Series A is generally a bit lower, considering that also the ventures who are not surviving such funding rounds and therefore either going bankrupt or getting sold is significantly higher. Now, where it becomes a bit more critical is this what we call here the volume weighted average of 30% of these ventures, basically looking into them and saying, okay, which of these have actually raised funding now over the past 18 months? Now, when we look into late stage ventures, we can basically say that about 50% of the ones that raised funding in 36 months have now also raised funding in the past 36 months, have now also raised funding in the past 18 months. Basically showing that about half of the ventures that have raised funding previously have now again raised funding in one or another way. When you then go down to the early and Series A ventures, it's only a quarter out of all ventures, and again, roughly the half of the ones that have raised funding before, making this actually extremely, let's call it critical already, if they are having a strong cash in bank or not. So their funding strength becomes significantly lower already. Now, what starts becoming extremely critical, and I move the graph over here to the past 12 months, is that we now look into the past 12 months. Basically, it's not so many ventures that have raised funding anymore, showing that basically either investors are becoming very tight with their pockets, whether they actually want to invest in, or the ventures were actually capable of monetizing their way and therefore generating income sources that outweigh the investment that they're doing. Now, this is always a very positive mindset. We being economists, generally being very pessimistic, what probably say that it looks more like that investors are not so open to invest at the moment in the current climate that we're in. Now, also what's quite interesting when we look into the numbers from above here, North America 54%, Europe 46%, Asia Pac 36%. Now, what we actually see here is that Asia Pac is actually the lowest in terms of the ventures that actually raised funding, which is an interesting point because it's such a diverse ecosystem. And what is not really shown in this report, and that we can probably deep dive a bit deeper into it, is that when we look into two particular countries, one is India, one is China. These are the ones where we see significant cash strap. Both ecosystems have been generally fairly strong in the funding performance and the velocity between funding rounds of ventures raising additional funding rounds. What we've now seen over the past 6 to 12 months is they become very tight. There aren't many investors who are actively deploying capital on a month-on-month basis of what we've seen in other regions before. And this is why we see this crunch hitting significantly harder. So it might not be Northeast Asia, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, where we still see funding floating in quite nicely. It's not Southeast Asia, Singapore, Indonesia. We see funding deals floating in. It's literally these two countries, considering that there are roughly having 40% of the entire ecosystem out of around 4,000 ventures in Asia Pacific.
Very, very clear, very clear. We have a question from the audience, by the way. I'm going to hold up that question there, and I want to extend a bit the conversation to compare indeed better Asia Pacific to the rest of the ecosystems. So if you could spare a bit of more words on how is Asia Pacific different to the US? I know that there is also another section of the report where you could share a bit more on the differences. But let's share the question from the audience.
Okay, so the question from the audience is, how are valuations being impacted? Now, it's always a tricky question. Everyone is always asking the same. There are impacts, especially in a recession environment, let's put it that way. The valuations are generally tumbling. Investors are having the upper hand because you don't have so many investors to choose from when you try to raise your funding at the moment. So the selection of investors that are actually actively deploying is getting smaller, and therefore they have a much stronger point in dropping the valuation of certain venture. Now, what we've seen over the past few years, especially during the COVID period, is that valuations were through the roof. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's been such a step back as compared to previously. It's more like we start balancing out slightly the over valuations that we've seen previously, and we come now more back to the basics and basically say, okay, it becomes more like a 4 to 8x valuation on funding is more likely than raising a 20x of what we've seen in between. We've seen ventures that are raising 15 million on a 400 million valuation. It's just through the roof, which are not valuations that are sustainable also in the long run. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we see too much of a discount at the moment. It's more like a passing on and coming back to the basics of where valuation should actually lay in.
Yeah, I guess there is another question on why VCs basically have been so much more cautious in the past. Indeed, it's something we just covered on the reasons of paying a bit more attention on where putting money, and also paying a bit more attention on the proof points, delivered by the ventures themselves, not just on the promise, but evaluating business model, operating model, go to market, etc., etc. So a bit more, as you were saying, back to the basic valuation. Okay, so, boom or bust.
to the first question here is like, why are investors so much more cautious? It's various factors that are coming in there. It's not so much that they become more cautious, but it becomes much tougher for a GP to raise funding from an LP at the moment to close that fund. The reason is that the interest rates at banks now with rising interest rates are so nice that I would rather park my millions of dollars in a safe haven, get my interest rates, get my 6, 7, 8% on those, than putting it into a VC fund that may or may not get a nice multiple out of the investment that I'm putting in there. So even investment funds, especially first-time investors, are struggling closing funds at the moment because they don't have the track record for their LPs to trust them that they can make out of their $1, $20, what a bank necessarily can't do. So it's more like this, there's so much strap on all sides that ultimately comes back to the ventures as well, that it gets harder for them to raise capital. This is why your selling point to an investor needs to be extremely strong at the moment as well, in order to convince them that you are not one of those annual flies that dies after a year after you burn through the $2 million of investment. And now the boom or bust question, which is also interesting. It's not so much about a boom or bust. Digital health is a very
I'm going to add also something on this. Yeah.
You can do that first. I'm
no, yeah, okay, yeah, you can breathe for a second. No, I just wanted to say it's a bit minimalistic, you know, as a vision to consider a sector that has a huge to yet deliver, okay, and is so much needed for several reasons. And those reasons, the key reasons being indeed affordability, accessibility, and the quality of healthcare. So these three pillars still remain unfulfilled by, you know, by the existing traditional ways, and digital health is indeed a means to fulfilling that. So I don't agree in using boom or bust, because that's also like like writing an article on the media, and we want to be a bit more diligent in replying these questions. So by looking at the fundamentals of why digital health was indeed creating, there are these three that still needs to be delivered, and digital health in different ways has shown to be delivering on those. So it's not a bust, it's indeed, as we were commenting before, a return to cautiousness. Let me see indeed what is the impact on the patients, what is the value you're delivering for healthcare providers. So it's more attention on the result and the impact. That's why, on top of the reasons that Derek explained.
Plus, it's also a bit of consolidation of the solutions that are existing within the market. So we've seen like 2 years ago, mental health solutions were extremely popular, even last year, and it's ongoing. So you saw many mental health solutions popping out everywhere across the entire globe, which doesn't necessarily mean that they are working. It's just that cash was so cheap during that time that you could raise $1 million on an idea that I make mental health more effective and I'm connecting you to tailored psychiatrists, which in the current environment where there's no like, you need to create market share. You need to show your investor that you are creating an actual impact, that you are creating revenue, which gets much, much tougher. So this is why we also don't see so many of these early stage deals floating in anymore. And we see more acquisitions happening now as well, as ventures are trying to come back to what they're good at, acquiring external solutions that are currently a bit underwater, to add them to their own portfolio. And now to the last question that I'm going to get to probably at the very end of how ventures can get through to 2023.
Exactly. Let's keep it open. Let's keep this question open. Let's go a bit ahead with the report. Would you like to spend a bit of word, or we can go directly into the examples that we wanted to share?
No, we can do that. This basically shows, similar to the previous slide, of how the ecosystems are very different from one another, also in terms of the funding strength, region by region. Now, the 42% is the Europe, actually. It moved a bit too far up here, unfortunately. Asia Pac and Europe have a very similar ecosystem. It's not so strong from a VC point of view, similar to Asia Pacific. It's a growing network of investors that are actively investing now across Europe as well, considering that from a regulatory side, the ecosystem becomes quite interesting, as many of the countries are following a similar path to the regulatory side of digital health. This is why we also don't see the same, let's call it the bust here. We don't see the same bust as what we've seen here in Asia Pacific with the funding strength. Now, we've seen a 2% drop between year end 2022 and the first quarter of 2023 in Europe, but in Asia Pacific, we saw a 4% drop, which is significantly higher as compared to what we've seen before. And this is why we basically can therefore say that, okay, Asia Pacific at the moment in the current climate might not be a good country for venture to freshly incorporate or to currently raise, considering it's very tough at the moment because every venture currently tries to raise, and investors literally have so many different ventures to their at their portfolio where they can say, I would like to invest in that, or I want to invest in that. So your unique selling point needs to be extremely high and to show revenues to the investors to actually show them this is my path to profitability, and I can make it happen within the next 12 to 24 months.
Yeah, it's a bit more challenging. Yeah. And competitive as a landscape. Let me go ahead. Okay. I think I find this interesting based also on our past conversation. So I think also our participants, the audience will appreciate the commentary that you are going to share on these famous media noteworthy digital health bankruptcy. Everybody has been reading about Pear Therapeutics, but there are other examples, not only in the US, but also indeed in Asia Pacific. And I know that Dario has some layer to convey on this, some messages. Also to explain what's different between US and Asia Pacific.
So I deliberately not go into Pear. I think it's a worn out topic. Everyone has been speaking about it. If you follow many digital health leaders on LinkedIn, you probably saw your timeline getting floated for about 3 weeks, only with comments about Pear Therapeutics. So I'm going to deep dive a bit into Lucira. Considering that company that people may not have heard so much about it. So the primary category here is slightly wrong because what Lucira is actually providing is at-home testing devices. There's an issue on the slide at the moment. So they're doing at-home testing. Now the company is fairly old, but they only got to attention in about 2020 when COVID started happening, considering that what they started doing is to deliver the PCR test directly to your home, and they actually had the device so that you can directly read out the samples at home. Now, the problem, so it's like an in vitro diagnostics device, basically. The problem that the company had is that under the EUA, so the Emergency Use Authority of the FDA in the US, they were allowed to operate, but only in minimal quantities. Now, at the same time, the company went public. There are certain issues when you bring your company public if your revenue isn't strong enough, considering that you start getting very hurt from your investors who now start actively investing into you. It's often hedge funds that are also hedging against you. There were many, many different factors with Lucira that came together here. One was they couldn't convince the FDA to give them their regulatory approval on time. So actually, they only got their actual regulatory approval 2 weeks after they actually went bankrupt, which was in March of this year.
No.
So the problem here was that the time for approval was way too long, and therefore the company had lots of issues to actually finance that through, considering getting your device medically approved is extremely expensive. So that kind of all fell back onto Lucira during that point. Even though the device works, they had issues in the beginning because the actual testing kits had scenes in there, which according to the FDA list were not allowed to be in there. So it got again delayed, considering that they had to look back into the chemical pool that they've been using for the PCR test because it's not allowed for human use, and therefore everything just got delayed. So there were many coincidences that actually came together why Lucira in the end failed, even though the solution actually works. Similar issues that we've kind of seen also with Pear here, and I'll make a bit of a comparison. Yeah. Pear solution works. Like there's no question asked that the digital therapeutics solution actually works. It's more this getting someone to use it and therefore actually making revenue out of it is way tougher in digital health than many people can actually think. The time to convince a physician, the time to convince a payer to A, use it, and B, to reimburse it or to bring it within their pipe is extremely difficult. And then you need to still convince the patient or the user in the end that they actually start using it. So you not just have to convince the payer to actually reimburse it or pay for it because it's very expensive. You need to convince the physician to actually prescribe it, and you need to convince the patient to actually use it. So you actually have three people whom you need to convince. Now, all of these companies went then under Chapter 11. I won't deep dive into what that means, but they can actually still operate, even though they can't really operate anymore because they need to be very cash strapped in the end. But both Mindstrong, here acquisition by Sondermind, and Lucira, which recently now was announced to get acquired by Pfizer as they're strengthening their COVID portfolio, managed to actually get out in the end. We're still waiting for pair, but it's highly likely that there's also going to be an exit in one or another way as well. Now, the difference between Asia Pac is you don't necessarily hear much about here companies dying because there are no these Chapter 11 filings of companies going bankrupt. It's just not in the tradition of how the markets here work. Now, we've started seeing that there are significant reforms in how the restructuring laws are getting set. The Chapter 11 regime is now accumulating the enactments, and in Singapore actually started introducing something back in 2017, which was then fixed, I think, in 2018 in an Insolvency Act or whatsoever. And actually now many companies start following that. So even though it's not so obvious yet that this bankruptcy of how it exists in the United States exists here, we start seeing many markets adopting it. So maybe moving forward, we start seeing companies getting bankrupt, but in order to then save the money to restructure themselves and maybe get back out of the bankruptcy and to continue operating or to selling off during that time. So we may not see so many busts happening anymore. So we only
Fantastic. Thank you for that. It was quite detailed. I hope it was also easily to be followed by indeed the audience. We have two questions. The first one is more, it's actually something we want to answer from the beginning, as in what are those key messages, that operators, founders should keep in mind going forward and while operating in this landscape, because it seems like a bit of doom. Talking about decline and talking about decrease and talking about stress, etc., right? So maybe if you could share like some key messages of what should they pay attention to in the future. And then the second question is okay, that's interesting. I like that. It's what should the investors basically be looking at? Okay, cool.
So let's probably start with the ventures first. It's extremely difficult to say, considering that there are totally different solutions within the digital health side, depending on how you go to market. You have the B2B, B2C, B2B solutions. So always of how you are structuring your company will be very different from one another. What we do always need to keep in mind, and this is unfortunately the honest truth, is think about the profitability very early on. Building an extremely difficult solution that may solve a proper problem may not be the best solution that you currently can build, considering that investors don't want to wait 7 years for the investment to actually start generating anything for them, considering that they can't even wait 7 years because their LPs sit in their neck to show them the return on their own investment. So if you do not show growing revenue in your first or second year, it's likely that your solution does not work. And you need to either think you pivot it, you change your audience, you try different go-to-market strategies, you find the correct partners out there in order to make your solution work. Now, Asia Pacific has always been a very challenging environment. Every country is very different from one another. If that your solution works in Indonesia doesn't mean that it will work in the Philippines and in Thailand after that as well. So choose your markets wisely, find the markets that have a very strong regulatory backing of the solution that you're trying to bring to market. And therefore, position your solution with the right players within the market as well. Now, we started now internally track a lot, how do partnerships actually map out in every part of the world. There's been another report that we recently published just on partnerships that basically just tells us, okay, actually, when you're in the US, try working with a health system, which is actually also not really true because health systems generally don't pay for the solution. They're just your research partners. So you need to find someone who actually pays for your solution, which is often the hardest question to actually answer, because you need to position your solution the correct way that it becomes interesting for someone to use. This is why I was never a big fan of these solutions like, oh, I'm having a mental health teleconsultation solution. Nice, but who should pay for that? It's going back to the users, because most of the insurance companies have implemented it themselves already, or they're already partnering with a very large other company. Therefore, you now launching something in its space that is very overcrowded, it's not very innovative, may not help you moving forward. And then to the investor side,
I would summarize it, more on the go-to-market model, be it via partner, be it via using, another channel as a distributor, etc., etc. So it's more indeed on the go-to market. So it's maybe worth spending time, in figuring out the business side of the solution rather than indeed the solution itself, which I mean, as we have noticed also in these cases, for example, has proven to be effective. So from a technological perspective, from an impact perspective, they are delivering value, but it's how do you actually remunerate, let's say, that value that it's an issue and is actually being seen, felt as an issue across categories, not just a single category. So yeah.
And from an investor point of view, it's always an interesting question. It always depends on where in the investment cycle you are in. If you're an early stage investor, look towards the team. If the team has a strong record in either leading within the organization where they're currently in, and you see that there's value in the solution that they are trying to solve, and they already have a certain market understanding of what they want to operate in, it's generally a very good goal, because they understand exactly, okay, we at Gale and Growth have been working with the entire industry over the past 7-8 years. If I launch something that's very insurance centric, and my product looks whole, it's highly likely that I will succeed, considering that we have a strong network that we've built and we can easily reach the customer at the end. Now, when you become more the Series A investor, you definitely need to start looking into how fast has the company been growing, because there's no clinical solution required for that. Have we seen number of partnerships growing? Have we seen revenue growing? Have we seen actual deals being signed that are driving towards making the company burn less fast as they initially did? So do we see and return on investment on the seed round already or not? And then when you go towards the Series C, Series D, Series E investors, even B investors, to some extent, when you're in Singapore, even Series A investors, you need to start looking into how fast can I scale this outside the country where I'm currently in? Can I bring this company global? If you are not within, let's say, in Indonesia or in India or in China, you definitely need to expand globally, because your markets are way too small. So is the team set up for that? Is even the C-suite set up to do that? Because if you have a very local team, they may understand the ecosystem here. They don't understand the US ecosystem. They don't understand the European ecosystem. So do we need to actually change the team behind it? And is the team ready to make the appropriate changes as well? How open is the company to innovate themselves, even from their company structure, in order to become an international business? So these discussions need to happen very early on, even if you are in your Series B funding round, because otherwise you stay stuck within the markets you're in. The markets are not strong and big enough in order to generate the necessary revenue, and therefore you likely will not succeed. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think we answered that quite exhaustively. Okay, we don't have any more questions from the audience, and we are also past our time. I don't have
one thing
any
to
more
probably note
questions
to add.
from my side, but yeah.
No, so the only thing that's probably to add, so if you're interested in the entire research, this mini report is available within Health Tech Alpha. Basic users can just download it. We give it away. If you want to understand more, you can always reach out to either Anna or myself. We're always open to have discussions with everyone. I'm very happy to answer all of your questions that are coming in.
Fantastic.
Cool.
Thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you to the audience for the questions. The session has been recorded, so it will be published at some point in our event space. So again, as Darren mentioned, if you have any more questions, please feel free to drop a message to either of us. Thank you all, and have a nice week ahead.